For almost all of our existence, becoming old was not something most humans prepared for. It was something few reached. The bodies of our ancestors were not designed around long retirements, but around survival in unstable landscapes, where injury, infection, hunger, and childbirth shaped how long a life could reasonably last. What we call old age today is not an ancient human norm. It is a rare outcome that only became common very recently in evolutionary time. If most humans who ever lived never experienced decades of decline, memory, and gradual aging, then what exactly changed? Why did 90% of human history have no old age? When we say that most of human history had no old age, we are not saying that no one ever became old. Skeletal remains from prehistoric sites show individuals who lived long enough for their joints to wear down, for teeth to erode, and for fractures to heal over many years. Some reached their 60s, and a few likely went beyond. The deeper point is different. Old age was not a common stage within the population. It was present, but it was rare enough that it did not define the structure of society. For nearly 300,000 years since Homo sapiens first appeared in Africa, the typical human community was composed mostly of children, adolescents, and young adults. The number of people who lived far beyond their reproductive years was small in proportion to the whole. To understand this clearly, we need to separate two measurements that are often blended together: life expectancy at birth and maximum lifespan. Life expectancy at birth in prehistoric populations was low, frequently estimated in the 20s or 30s. This does not mean that adults routinely died at 30. It means that many children did not survive the earliest and most vulnerable years. High infant and child mortality pulled the average downward. If a child survived past early childhood, the chances of reaching 40 or 50 improved. Even so, surviving into the late 60s or 70s was uncommon. The biological capacity for a longer lifespan may have existed, but the likelihood of reaching it was limited by daily risks. In small mobile hunter-gatherer bands, which reflect the social pattern of early Homo sapiens, population sizes were modest. A group might include 20 to 50 individuals, sometimes slightly more. Within such a structure, even if one or two members lived into advanced age, they did not form a broad generational layer. There was no large class of elders shaping long-term institutions, inheritance systems, or sustained economic planning. The demographic profile resembled a steep pyramid: many young, fewer middle-aged adults, and very few elderly individuals. This pattern is supported by both ethnographic observations of recent foraging societies and by age distributions inferred from prehistoric burial sites. Upper Paleolithic cemeteries show a predominance of young adults, with relatively few skeletons identified as elderly. The environment in which our species evolved helps explain this structure. During the late Pleistocene, climatic conditions shifted repeatedly. Resources fluctuated. Groups moved frequently across landscapes that required physical endurance. Mortality was often external rather than internal. Death more commonly resulted from infection, injury, childbirth complications, nutritional stress, or exposure to harsh conditions than from the gradual cellular decline we associate with modern aging. In such settings, life was often shortened by immediate threats rather than extended into decades of visible senescence. None of this suggests that elders were absent or unvalued. Evidence of healed injuries indicates care and social support. What it suggests instead is that reaching old age was not the expected outcome for most individuals. It was possible, but not typical. The early human body evolved within populations where survival to reproduction was essential, and survival long after reproduction was uncertain. If the majority of humans across deep time did not live to experience prolonged aging, then the absence of a large elderly population was not unusual. It was the demographic foundation on which our species first grew. If we look more closely at the age structure of early human groups, the absence of a large elderly population becomes easier to see in practical terms. Imagine a small band of Homo sapiens living in eastern Africa around 200,000 years ago, near the ecological landscapes where our species first appeared. Such a group would likely consist of several families connected by kinship. Children would be numerous. Young adults would form the physical core of daily survival. A few middle-aged individuals would carry experience and memory. Truly old individuals, those far beyond reproductive age, would be uncommon enough to stand out. This pattern was not the result of a cultural preference against age. It was the outcome of demographic mathematics shaped by environment and biology. High mortality in infancy and childhood reduced the number of individuals who even reached adulthood. Those who survived to reproductive age faced additional risks from hunting accidents, infectious disease, interpersonal conflict, and childbirth. Each layer of risk thinned the population before advanced age could become widespread. Over thousands of generations, this produced a stable structure in which most people were young, and only a small fraction grew visibly old. Archaeological evidence reinforces this picture. When anthropologists examined skeletal assemblages from prehistoric burial grounds, they estimate age at death by analyzing tooth wear, bone fusion, and degenerative changes in joints. The distribution is rarely uniform across ages. Instead, it tends to cluster heavily in young adulthood, with fewer individuals categorized as elderly. This does not mean that ancient people lacked longevity entirely. It means that the proportion of elders within any given community was limited. In a settlement of 30 individuals, perhaps one might be over 60, sometimes none. From the perspective of daily life, that difference matters. A society with one elder is not structured like a society where 1/3 of the population is over 65. The scale changes the social role of age. In early human bands, mobility was constant. Seasonal migration followed animal herds and plant cycles. Carrying capacity was constrained. Food had to be gathered or hunted repeatedly. Under these conditions, a population dominated by physically capable adults was adaptive. The demographic pyramid aligned with environmental demands. There was little surplus to support large numbers of individuals who could not fully participate in subsistence tasks. That reality did not eliminate care or cooperation, but it limited how common long dependency and old age could become. When we compare this structure to modern industrial societies, the contrast is striking. Today, in many countries, a significant portion of the population is elderly. Entire institutions, retirement systems, healthcare structures, intergenerational housing patterns are built around prolonged aging. For most of human existence, such arrangements would have been unnecessary because the age distribution did not require them. The social fabric evolved in communities where elders were respected, but relatively few. The expectation of spending decades beyond active subsistence was not woven into early human planning. Returning to our origin in Africa, the earliest Homo sapiens lived in ecological niches that demanded adaptability. Longevity beyond reproductive years may have provided advantages in knowledge transmission, but it did not become numerically dominant. Natural selection operates on patterns of survival and reproduction, not on aspirations. If most individuals did not survive long into advanced age, then the demographic center of gravity remained with the young. In that sense, the absence of widespread old age was not an anomaly in the past. It was the statistical baseline from which our species expanded across continents. When we imagine early human life, it is tempting to picture a continuous chain of grandparents, parents, and children living together across many decades. That image feels natural to us because in the modern world, prolonged aging is common. Yet, for most of the time since Homo sapiens first emerged in Africa, multi-generational depth was narrower. There were generations, but they were compressed. The overlap between a grandparent and a grandchild was possible, though not guaranteed, and often shorter than what we expect today. The rhythm of life moved more quickly from birth to reproduction to vulnerability. This compression shaped how memory, knowledge, and continuity were carried. In small foraging groups, information about landscapes, seasonal patterns, animal behavior, and social alliances was essential. Older individuals who survived into later adulthood likely held valuable experience. However, because their numbers were limited, knowledge transmission did not depend on a large aging class. Skills were distributed broadly among active adults. Learning occurred through participation rather than extended retirement years devoted to reflection. The structure of the population meant that experience had to circulate before individuals grew physically frail. There was little assurance of decades available for gradual decline. The biological pattern supports this. Human aging is gradual at the cellular level, but the expression of that aging becomes socially visible only when individuals survive long enough for decline to accumulate. In environments marked by infection, injury, and nutritional stress, Many lives ended before advanced senescence became prominent. The body did not need to sustain long periods of low productivity after reproduction because such periods were statistically uncommon. Natural selection primarily shapes traits that affect reproductive success. Once reproduction and child-rearing were largely completed, the selective pressure to maintain bodily systems at peak efficiency weakened. This does not mean that evolution ignored later life entirely. Post-reproductive individuals could contribute through childcare, food sharing, and social cohesion. Yet their contribution operated within a demographic minority. The archaeological record gives subtle hints of this compression. Skeletal analyses often reveal adults who died between 30 and 50, with fewer clearly categorized beyond 60. Degenerative joint disease appears, but not in overwhelming frequency. Tooth loss and wear are present, but not uniformly extreme across large samples. The pattern suggests that while aging occurred biologically as it does today, fewer individuals accumulated its full visible course. From the perspective of deep time, the human lifespan was shaped less by prolonged internal decline and more by exposure to external hazards. Returning to our species' origin point, the early African landscapes were dynamic and sometimes harsh. Mobility, cooperation, and physical resilience were central to survival. Under such conditions, the demographic center of gravity remained in youth and middle adulthood. The expectation of living into a long period defined primarily by aging was not embedded in daily planning. Social bonds formed across generations, but they were not anchored in a large population of elders. For nearly 90% of human history, old age existed as a possibility rather than as a common stage. It was present at the edges of communities, not at their core. Understanding this compression of generational time helps clarify what is meant by saying that most of our past had no old age. It was not the absence of aging itself, but the rarity of a long, widespread elder phase that distinguishes deep human history from the present. To understand why old age remained rare for most of human history, we have to look beyond bones and numbers and return to the environments in which our species first formed. Homo sapiens emerged in Africa during the late Pleistocene, a period marked by climatic fluctuation rather than stability. Rainfall patterns shifted, grasslands expanded and contracted, lakes appeared and disappeared. The landscapes that shaped early human life were not fixed backgrounds but moving systems that demanded flexibility. In such conditions, survival depended on mobility, cooperation, and the ability to respond quickly to change. These ecological realities shaped how long individuals typically lived, not by accelerating biological aging, but by increasing exposure to risk. Early human groups moved frequently across territories to follow seasonal resources. Hunting large animals required coordination and physical endurance. Gathering plant foods required knowledge of cycles and locations. Water sources could dry unexpectedly. A sudden drought or cold period could disrupt access to food. These pressures did not gradually wear down the body over decades. They created immediate challenges that could end life abruptly. Injury from hunting, falls, animal attacks, or interpersonal conflict could become fatal without medical intervention. A wound that would be treatable today could become life-threatening in a matter of days. Infection was a constant presence in environments without sanitation or antibiotics. In this ecological frame, mortality often arrived before the slow processes of advanced aging became visible. Climate variability amplified these risks. During glacial and interglacial cycles, African environments experienced repeated shifts in temperature and precipitation. Populations expanded and contracted in response. Archaeological evidence shows phases of dispersal out of Africa and later contractions back into refugia. These demographic fluctuations suggest that human groups were repeatedly tested by environmental stress. When resources narrowed, weaker individuals, including the very young and the very old, were more vulnerable. Over tens of thousands of years, this pattern shaped a population structure weighted toward those in their physically productive years. This does not imply that elders were abandoned or excluded. Evidence of healed fractures and long-term survival with disabilities suggests care and cooperation were present. However, care itself required energy and food, both of which were limited by environmental constraints. In small bands, numbering perhaps 30 or 40 individuals, the ecological margin could be thin. Carrying capacity depended on mobility and access to seasonal abundance. a large proportion of dependent individuals, whether infants or elderly, placed strain on group resources. The demographic balance that persisted across much of the Pleistocene reflects this reality. Many children were born, many did not survive early childhood, and relatively few individuals reached advanced age. Returning to the point of origin clarifies the scale of time involved. For nearly 300,000 years, human life unfolded within foraging ecologies shaped by shifting climates and local hazards. Agriculture, permanent settlements, and modern medicine represent only a small fraction of this span. The environments that molded our biology were not structured around stable food surpluses or protected living conditions. They were structured around adaptation and movement. Under such pressures, life expectancy remained constrained not because the human body was incapable of longevity, but because the environment continually intervened. In that deep ecological context, the rarity of old age was not an accident. It was a reflection of how survival operated in the landscapes where our species began. Beyond climate and movement, the ecological details of daily life further limited how often humans reached advanced age. Early Homo sapiens lived within food webs that required constant negotiation. Large game animals provided substantial calories but carried danger. Smaller prey required time and energy. Plant foods varied by season and region. The nutritional landscape was not uniform. Periods of relative abundance were followed by scarcity. Even in resource-rich zones of eastern and southern Africa, variability shaped survival. When rainfall patterns shifted or herds migrated unpredictably, human groups had to adjust quickly. In such systems, a single failed hunting expedition or a prolonged dry season could weaken individuals already near the margins of health. Nutrition directly influences resilience. Repeated cycles of shortage and recovery impose stress on the body. While the human organism is remarkably adaptable, chronic undernutrition or periodic famine increases susceptibility to infection and reduces the capacity to recover from injury. Over decades, such pressures accumulate, yet many individuals did not experience those decades. The combination of ecological uncertainty and limited medical knowledge meant that survival often hinged on immediate physical strength and immune response. Those in the prime of adulthood were more likely to endure these challenges. The very young and the very old were more vulnerable when food was scarce. Predation and competition added another layer. Early humans shared landscapes with large carnivores. Although cooperation and tool use reduced risk, it did not eliminate it. Living in open savannas, wooded grasslands, and near water sources exposed groups to animals that were both prey and threat. Defensive vigilance required mobility and alertness. Aging bodies, with slower reflexes or reduced stamina, faced greater difficulty in such contexts. This ecological reality does not imply deliberate exclusion of elders, but it clarifies why the environment naturally filtered populations toward those in their most physically capable years. Disease ecology also shaped lifespan. Before the rise of dense agricultural settlements, epidemic diseases were less common, yet localized infections were constant. Parasites, gastrointestinal pathogens, and wound infections circulated in small populations. Without antibiotics or antiseptic practices, minor injuries could escalate. The immune system of a younger adult might contain such threats more effectively than that of an older individual. Over long stretches of time, these biological and ecological interactions influenced which age groups were most likely to persist. Archaeological traces of mobility, temporary campsites, stone tool scatters, seasonal occupation layers reveal that early humans did not remain long in one place. Movement reduces some disease burdens but increases exposure to environmental hazards. Long-distance travel over uneven terrain carries risk of falls and fractures. While some broken bones healed, as skeletal evidence confirms, others likely proved fatal. The capacity to recover from trauma declines with age. In an environment without surgical intervention, this decline had practical consequences. Returning again to our species' beginnings in Africa helps maintain perspective. For the vast majority of human existence, life unfolded in ecosystems that rewarded adaptability and physical endurance. Longevity beyond reproductive years may have offered social advantages, yet it unfolded within a narrow demographic band. The environment did not favor a large population living decades past active subsistence. Instead, it maintained a structure where youth and early adulthood dominated. The rarity of widespread old age was thus not simply a feature of biology, but an outcome of ecological balance operating over hundreds of thousands of years. Environmental pressure did not operate only through dramatic events like drought or predation. It worked quietly, through energy balance. Every organism exists within a budget of calories gained and calories spent. For early Homo sapiens, that budget was tight. Food had to be located, processed, and shared. Water had to be carried or reached. Shelter had to be built or found. In mobile foraging societies, energy expenditure was continuous. Walking long distances, climbing, digging, lifting, and crafting tools demanded sustained physical effort. Under such conditions, the body's resources were directed toward maintenance that supported immediate survival and reproduction. There was little surplus energy available for extended periods of low productivity. This ecological arithmetic shaped who could persist through time. In a landscape without stored surplus, each additional dependent individual increased pressure on the group. Infants required care, and their survival ensured continuity. Adults in their prime generated most of the calories and protection. Older individuals, especially those experiencing physical decline, depended more heavily on collective support. Ethnographic studies of recent hunter-gatherers show that elders often contribute knowledge, childcare, and social mediation, yet these contributions occur within small groups where numbers remain limited. If only a few individuals survive into advanced age, their presence enriches the group without overwhelming its energy budget. If many did, the ecological balance would shift. Over hundreds of thousands of years, environments that did not regularly support large elderly populations helped maintain a demographic profile weighted toward youth. The energy demands of pregnancy and lactation also interacted with ecological limits. Women's bodies invest heavily in reproduction. In contexts of nutritional stress, fertility can decline, spacing births, yet high infant mortality often led to repeated pregnancies. This cycle further constrained maternal health and increased mortality risk. In such a system, many women did not reach advanced age, not because of accelerated aging, but because reproductive strain intersected with environmental scarcity. The cumulative effect reinforced a population structure where few individuals experienced decades beyond child-rearing years. Seasonal variation intensified this pattern. During periods of abundance, groups could sustain broader age ranges. During scarcity, vulnerability increased. Older adults, whose muscle mass and immune efficiency naturally decline with age, faced higher risk when food was limited or temperatures dropped. Over evolutionary time, this seasonal filtering shaped the proportion of elders within communities. It did not eliminate them, but it kept their numbers small. Returning to the African origins of our species clarifies the scale. For nearly 90% of human history, life unfolded within ecosystems that required constant negotiation with energy limits. There were no granaries, no permanent food stores large enough to buffer multiple bad years, no institutional safety nets. The body that evolved under these conditions is capable of long life, yet it evolved in populations where reaching that potential was uncommon. The rarity of old age, therefore, was not solely a matter of biological decline. It was a reflection of ecological economics. The landscapes in which humans first became human did not regularly generate the surplus required to sustain large numbers of individuals far beyond their peak productive years. In that quiet arithmetic of calories and care, the demographic youthfulness of early humanity was continually reinforced. If the environment limited how often humans reached advanced age, the structure of the human body also reflects the priorities of natural selection. Evolution does not design organisms with future comfort in mind. It shapes traits that increase the likelihood of surviving long enough to reproduce and raise offspring. Once those tasks are largely completed, the intensity of selection weakens. This principle, supported by evolutionary biology, helps explain why the human body is capable of longevity but not optimized for decades of gradual decline. The earliest Homo sapiens in Africa inherited biological systems shaped by millions of years of hominin evolution under conditions of uncertainty. Muscles, bones, immune responses, and metabolic pathways were tuned for endurance, mobility, and fertility. They were not tuned for sustained low-intensity aging across many decades because, statistically, Few individuals reach that stage. The force of natural selection declines with age. Harmful mutations that express early in life are strongly selected against because they reduce reproductive success. Mutations that express after reproduction are less strongly filtered, since their impact on gene transmission is smaller. Over long spans of time, this dynamic allows late-acting weaknesses to persist in populations. The result is not a deliberate design flaw but a predictable pattern. The body maintains itself robustly through reproductive years and gradually loses resilience afterward. In prehistoric populations where external mortality was common, many individuals did not live long enough for late-acting vulnerabilities to become widespread. This means that the evolutionary investment in long-term maintenance remained limited. The concept of antagonistic pleiotropy further clarifies this pattern. Some biological traits that enhance survival or fertility early in life may have costs later on. For example, metabolic systems that efficiently store energy support survival during scarcity and enable reproduction. Yet over long periods, such efficiency can contribute to chronic conditions in modern environments of abundance. In ancestral settings marked by variable food supply, the early life benefits outweighed late life costs. Since relatively few individuals survived into extended old age, the later consequences exerted less evolutionary pressure. This biological logic unfolded within the African landscapes where Homo sapiens originated. In small groups navigating fluctuating climates, the primary evolutionary challenge was to reach reproductive maturity and successfully rear offspring. A body capable of surviving to 40 or 50 and contributing to the next generation was sufficient for gene propagation. Longevity beyond that point could provide social advantages, such as knowledge transmission and childcare support, but those advantages operated within a minority demographic. They did not redefine the central evolutionary target. Evidence from comparative biology supports this interpretation. Many mammals show a pattern in which survival drops significantly after reproductive years. Humans are unusual in having a relatively long post-reproductive lifespan compared to other primates, especially in females. Yet even this extended lifespan did not translate into a large elderly population in deep history. The potential for longevity existed, but environmental and biological constraints limited how often it was realized. The body's gradual decline after midlife reduced muscle mass. Slower cellular repair, increasing susceptibility to disease is not a recent malfunction. It reflects evolutionary priorities shaped in contexts where prolonged old age was uncommon. Returning to the central question, the rarity of old age for most of human history was not simply imposed by harsh environments. It was also embedded in the biological architecture of a species optimized for survival through reproduction rather than for extended aging. The gradual decline of the body after midlife is not a sudden failure but a shift in balance. Cells accumulate damage over time from normal metabolic processes. DNA repair systems correct much of this damage, yet not perfectly. Proteins misfold, oxidative stress increases, and tissues slowly lose elasticity. These processes occur in every human body, regardless of era. What differs across history is how long individuals live with these accumulating changes. In early Homo sapiens populations, many lives ended before cellular aging reached advanced stages. The biological machinery for repair and maintenance evolved to be sufficient for survival through reproductive years, not to guarantee many additional decades. This pattern aligns with evolutionary theory known as the disposable soma hypothesis. According to this framework, organisms allocate limited energy between reproduction and long-term bodily maintenance. When resources are scarce, prioritizing reproduction ensures genetic continuation even if maintenance is imperfect. In the fluctuating African environments where our species first formed, such allocation made sense. Energy invested in producing and nurturing offspring could outweigh energy invested in perfect cellular repair across extended old age. Over thousands of generations, this trade-off shaped the physiology we carry today. Bone density illustrates this dynamic. During youth and early adulthood, bone mass increases, reaching a peak that supports physical activity and reproduction. After midlife, bone density gradually declines. In modern societies with long life expectancy, this decline can lead to fractures in advanced age. In prehistoric settings, however, fewer individuals survived long enough for widespread osteoporotic fractures to accumulate. The biological tendency toward bone loss existed, but its full demographic impact was limited by earlier mortality from other causes. Muscle mass follows a similar trajectory. Peak strength supports hunting, gathering, and mobility. After reproductive years, muscle gradually diminishes. In a context without abundant caloric surplus, maintaining high muscle mass into late life was energetically costly. Natural selection did not strongly favor mechanisms to prevent this decline beyond the age when reproduction was largely complete. The immune system also reflects age-dependent change. Immune competence is robust in early adulthood but gradually weakens with age. In environments without antibiotics, this weakening increased vulnerability to infection. Yet because many individuals did not reach very advanced ages, the demographic visibility of immune senescence remained limited. The body's aging processes unfolded quietly within a minority of the population. Returning to our species' origin helps clarify the scale of these dynamics. For nearly 300,000 years, Homo sapiens lived in small groups navigating ecological uncertainty. Selection pressures emphasized early survival, fertility, and child-rearing success. Late life decline, while biologically real, did not dominate the evolutionary landscape because relatively few individuals experience prolonged old age. The result is a species capable of long life, yet not biologically optimized for decades of low-intensity aging. The rarity of old age across most of human history was therefore intertwined with cellular trade-offs embedded in our physiology. Aging was always present, but its extended expression across large populations is a recent demographic development rather than an ancient norm. Human aging also reflects a subtle distinction between biological possibility and evolutionary expectation. The human body contains mechanisms that allow for extended lifespan under favorable conditions. Telomere maintenance, DNA repair enzymes, antioxidant systems, and hormonal regulation all contribute to longevity. None of these systems are absent in prehistoric humans. What differs across time is the probability that individuals could live long enough for these mechanisms to sustain them into advanced age. Evolution does not eliminate longevity. It calibrates how much energy is devoted to preserving it. In ancestral African environments where Homo sapiens first expanded, the average life course was shaped by early reproduction and physical labor. Puberty marked a transition into roles tied directly to subsistence and social contribution. Fertility typically began earlier than in many modern societies. With earlier reproduction came earlier parental investment. This compressed timeline meant that much of an individual's evolutionary impact occurred within the first half of life. From the perspective of gene transmission, surviving into the 40s could be sufficient. Beyond that threshold, the evolutionary returns diminished, even though social contributions could continue. One example of extended post-reproductive lifespan in humans is menopause. Compared to other primates, human females often live many years after fertility ends. Some evolutionary models suggest that grandmaternal support may have enhanced offspring survival, indirectly favoring longer female lifespan. Yet even if such mechanisms operated, they functioned within small populations. The presence of some long-lived individuals did not create a broad demographic category of elders. It created a minority who contributed through knowledge, childcare, and social stability. Their existence enriched communities but did not shift the overall age distribution toward prolonged aging. The male life course followed different patterns, often shaped by risk-taking and physical competition. Injury, conflict, and hunting hazards likely reduced survival in middle adulthood. Skeletal remains from prehistoric contexts show evidence of trauma consistent with physically demanding lives. Even when injuries healed, cumulative strain reduced resilience. The biological capacity to age slowly remained, but exposure to hazard limited its expression. The evolutionary architecture of humans, therefore, contains a dual character. On one hand, we are capable of living into our 70s and beyond under supportive conditions. On the other hand, our physiology was shaped in populations where most individuals did not routinely experience such extended years. Cellular aging processes, hormonal shifts, and musculoskeletal decline unfold predictably with time. Yet for the vast majority of human history, environmental and social pressures truncated life before advanced senescence became widespread. Returning again to the African origins of our species emphasizes this long baseline. For nearly 90% of human existence, small groups navigated landscapes without sanitation, antibiotics, or stable surplus. Selection pressures favored survival through reproductive maturity and the successful raising of children. Longevity beyond that was possible but not statistically central. The human body as it evolved reflects this balance. It carries the tools for long life, but it was not built in a world where old age would become a common demographic experience. One of the strongest forces shaping early human age structure was not the death of the old, but the vulnerability of the very young. In prehistoric populations, infant and child mortality was high by modern standards. This single demographic factor lowered average life expectancy dramatically and reshaped the visible structure of communities. When many children die before reaching adulthood, the proportion of the population that survives into later decades becomes smaller, even if some individuals are biologically capable of long life. To understand why most of human history had no widespread old age, we must begin with the earliest years of life. In the African environments where Homo sapiens first emerged, childbirth itself carried significant risk. Without surgical intervention, antibiotics, or advanced obstetric care, complications during delivery could threaten both mother and infant. Even when birth was successful, survival in the first year depended on nutrition, maternal health, and protection from infection. Breastfeeding provided immune support, yet it also linked infant survival closely to maternal survival. If a mother died or became severely ill, her infant's chances diminished sharply. These biological dependencies amplified early mortality. Infectious disease played a constant role. Although small, mobile bands may have avoided large epidemics, localized infections remained common. Gastrointestinal pathogens, respiratory infections, and parasitic diseases could be fatal for infants with developing immune systems. In environments without clean water systems or controlled sanitation, exposure to microbes was continuous. Many children likely died from illnesses that are easily treated today. From a demographic perspective, each infant death pulled the average lifespan downward. A community could contain individuals who reach 50 or 60, yet still display a low overall life expectancy because many never passed early childhood. Nutritional stress added another layer. Seasonal variation in food availability meant that infants and young children were especially vulnerable during lean periods. Weaning introduced new risks, as children shifted from breast milk to foraged foods that might be less reliable or harder to digest. Growth requires sustained caloric intake and micronutrients. Shortfalls in either increase susceptibility to disease and developmental complications. Over thousands of generations, this vulnerability shaped the population pyramid. Many were born, fewer survived to adulthood, still fewer reached old age. Archaeological evidence supports this pattern. Burial sites from prehistoric contexts often contain a high proportion of juvenile remains. Age estimation based on dental eruption and bone development reveals significant mortality in early life. This pattern is not unique to one region but appears across multiple prehistoric populations. It reflects a structural reality rather than isolated events. When a population consistently loses a large fraction of its youngest members, the base of the demographic pyramid remains wide, while its upper levels remain narrow. Returning to the origin of our species reinforces the scale of this influence. For nearly 300,000 years, human communities operated without modern medical systems. Childhood survival depended on maternal health, group support, and environmental stability. Each infant who did not survive altered the statistical picture of the population. Even if the biological potential for longevity existed, the demographic pathway to reach it was narrow. In this way, the fragility of early life indirectly limited the visibility of old age. A society in which many do not reach adulthood cannot produce a large class of elders. The absence of widespread old age was therefore linked not only to how long adults lived, but to how many children survived long enough to become adults at all. The vulnerability of early childhood did more than reduce averages. It reshaped how generations overlapped. In small foraging communities, a child who survived the first few years had already passed through one of the most dangerous phases of life. Yet, even after infancy, risks remained high. Falls, burns, animal encounters, and untreated infections could end a young life quickly. The environment in which Homo sapiens first spread across Africa was not engineered for safety. Open fires, sharp tools, uneven terrain, and exposure to weather were part of daily existence. Childhood unfolded within the same physical world as adulthood, without the protective buffers common in modern societies. Because mortality was concentrated in the earliest years, each generation narrowed before it matured. If many children were born but fewer survived into adolescence, the demographic base thinned as it rose. This pattern affected the likelihood that individuals would live long enough to become grandparents. For a grandparent generation to be common, two demographic conditions must align. Children must survive to adulthood, and adults must survive long after reproduction. In prehistoric contexts, both pathways were fragile. High child mortality meant that fewer individuals entered adulthood. Adult mortality from environmental and biological causes further reduced the numbers who could progress into advanced age. The result was a compressed generational ladder. Archaeological data from various prehistoric sites reveal this narrowing effect. Age at death profiles reconstructed from dental and skeletal analysis often show substantial juvenile mortality followed by a concentration of deaths in young and middle adulthood. Individuals clearly identified as elderly appear, but they represent a minority. This does not imply that care was absent. On the contrary, evidence of healed injuries in children suggests attentive social support. Yet even with cooperation, biological vulnerability remained high. A respiratory infection in a child, without modern treatment, could escalate rapidly. A minor wound could become systemic. These quiet biological realities operated continuously in early human communities. Nutrition and growth also shaped long-term survival. Early developmental stress can have lasting physiological consequences. If a child experienced repeated infections or malnutrition, their immune system and organ development might be compromised. Such early life stress can influence susceptibility to disease later in life. In prehistoric populations, where nutritional stability was uncertain, these cumulative effects may have reduced the probability of reaching advanced age, even for those who survived childhood. Returning to the origins of our species clarifies the timescale of these pressures. For nearly 90% of human history, life unfolded without vaccines, antibiotics, or pediatric medicine. Childhood survival depended on maternal health, breastfeeding, food availability, and collective protection. Each generation had to pass through narrow biological gates before adulthood. The more fragile these gates, the fewer individuals emerged to form an older generation decades later. In this way, the absence of widespread old age was partly the echo of childhood vulnerability. A society cannot sustain a large population of elders if a significant portion of its children do not reach maturity. The demographic structure of early humanity was shaped at the beginning of life, long before the processes of aging became visible. When we step back and view early human populations across deep time, childhood mortality becomes more than a statistic. It becomes a structural force that shaped how societies perceived time itself. In communities where many children did not survive to adulthood, the continuity of generations was fragile. Each surviving child represented a substantial investment of energy, protection, and hope. The uncertainty of early life made the transition into adolescence and adulthood a significant threshold. Yet, because this threshold was difficult to cross, the number of individuals who could later become elders remained proportionally small. This demographic narrowing began at birth and echoed forward through decades. The emotional and social consequences of this pattern likely influenced how early Homo sapiens organized care and cooperation. High infant mortality does not imply indifference. On the contrary, the evolutionary value of offspring would have intensified parental investment. Anthropological research on contemporary small-scale societies shows extensive communal involvement in childcare. Cooperative breeding, where relatives and non-parents assist in raising children, is a well-documented feature of human social systems. Such cooperation may have evolved partly in response to the vulnerability of early life. Yet even with collective support, the biological risks of infancy and early childhood remained substantial in environments without modern medicine. This persistent fragility ensured that not every birth would translate into a mature adult decades later. From a demographic perspective, this pattern continually constrained the upper layers of the age structure. Imagine a band of 40 individuals in a late Pleistocene African landscape. If half of all children born into that group failed to survive early childhood, the pool of future adults was immediately reduced. Those who did reach adulthood then faced additional hazards from injury, infection, and childbirth. Each successive stage filtered the population further. By the time a cohort approached 60 years of age, only a fraction of the original births remained. The rarity of elders was therefore not a single-stage outcome, but the cumulative result of multiple filters operating across the life course. Archaeological burial sites provide quiet confirmation of this pattern. High proportions of juvenile remains indicate that many lives ended before adulthood. While some cemeteries show individuals who lived into advanced age, their relative scarcity aligns with demographic modeling of high early mortality societies. These skeletal distributions do not tell personal stories, but they outline structural realities. A wide base of births combined with substantial early loss produces a narrow apex. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this demographic geometry became a stable feature of human existence. Returning to the origins of Homo sapiens in Africa reinforces the magnitude of this time span. For nearly 300,000 years, childhood survival was uncertain in ways unfamiliar to most modern societies. The absence of vaccines, antiseptics, and controlled environments meant that many lives ended quietly and early. Even if the human body carried the potential for longevity, the pathway to reach old age was statistically narrow from the beginning of life. In this sense, the rarity of old age across most of human history was rooted as much in the fragility of infancy as in the decline of later years. The demographic story of aging begins at birth, and for most of our past, that beginning was the most uncertain stage of all. In addition to childhood vulnerability, the physical risks of adult life further limited how often humans reached advanced age. Early Homo sapiens lived in environments where daily survival required direct engagement with the natural world. Hunting large animals, processing carcasses with stone tools, climbing uneven terrain, and traveling long distances were routine activities. Each carried the possibility of injury. In a world without surgical intervention, antiseptics, or antibiotics, even a small wound could become fatal. Infection was not an abstract threat, but a constant presence. A deep cut from a sharp stone edge or an animal's tusk could introduce bacteria that the body might not contain. Fever, sepsis, and systemic complications could follow. Many adults likely died not from slow internal decline, but from injuries sustained during otherwise ordinary tasks. Skeletal remains from prehistoric contexts provide quiet testimony to both resilience and risk. Anthropologists have documented healed fractures, suggesting that some individuals survived significant trauma and received care from their communities. Yet the presence of healed injuries also implies that many other injuries did not heal. The archaeological record preserves only those who survived long enough for bone to remodel. It cannot capture the countless soft tissue infections or untreated internal injuries that ended lives more quickly. This selective visibility reminds us that survival into middle age was not guaranteed, and survival into advanced age even less so. Childbirth added another layer of adult mortality, particularly for women. Without modern obstetric care, complications such as obstructed labor, hemorrhage, or infection could be life-threatening. The human pelvis, adapted for bipedal locomotion, creates a narrow birth canal relative to infant head size. This anatomical balance, beneficial for upright walking, increases delivery risk. In small prehistoric groups, maternal death would have had cascading effects on offspring, survival, and social stability. Repeated pregnancies, common in societies without modern contraception, compounded these risks. Many women likely did not survive through multiple childbirths, further reducing the number who might reach old age. Infectious disease also affected adults directly. While dense urban epidemics were rare before agriculture, localized outbreaks of pathogens were constant. Gastrointestinal diseases from contaminated water, respiratory infections in close-knit groups, and parasitic infestations circulated continuously. The immune system can overcome many infections, but repeated exposure weakens resilience. In environments shaped by fluctuating climate and limited nutrition, recovery was uncertain. An illness that a well-fed modern individual might survive could become fatal under nutritional stress. Returning to the African origins of our species clarifies the long baseline of these hazards. For nearly 300,000 years, Human adults operated without medical systems capable of reliably preventing infection or managing trauma. Survival required physical strength, cooperation, and endurance. Those who reached 40 or 50 had already navigated decades of risk. Each additional year increased cumulative exposure to injury and disease. The rarity of old age was therefore reinforced by the ordinary dangers of adulthood. Death often came through acute events rather than prolonged decline. In such a context, aging as a long, visible process remained statistically uncommon. The demographic youthfulness of early humanity was sustained not only by childhood mortality and evolutionary trade-offs, but also by the constant physical hazards woven into adult life. Beyond visible injuries and dramatic events, there were quieter forms of physiological wear that shaped adult survival long before advanced age could emerge. Repetitive physical strain left marks on bones and joints. Stone tool production required forceful, repeated motions of the hands and shoulders. Carrying water, firewood, and food over long distances placed stress on the spine and hips. Grinding plant materials with stone implements demanded sustained upper body effort. Over years, these tasks produced degenerative changes that are visible in skeletal remains from prehistoric populations. Arthritis, vertebral compression, and joint remodeling appear in adults who likely did not live far into what we would call old age. These signs indicate that the body's tissues were subjected to intense mechanical demand throughout adulthood. In an environment without pain management or orthopedic care, chronic musculoskeletal damage could reduce mobility and productivity. Reduced mobility in a small foraging band carried practical consequences. Hunting and gathering required coordinated movement. An adult with severe joint degeneration or chronic back pain may have depended more heavily on others for food acquisition. While cooperation and food sharing were central features of early human societies, resource limits constrained how many dependent adults could be supported at once. Chronic impairment increased vulnerability during periods of scarcity. A temporary food shortage that a healthy adult might endure could prove fatal for someone already weakened by long-term strain. Dental health offers another window into these cumulative stresses. Archaeological studies of early Homo sapiens and other prehistoric populations reveal extensive tooth wear, fractures, and abscesses. Diets that included unprocessed plant fibers, grit from stone grinding, and tough animal tissues accelerated enamel erosion. Dental infections could spread beyond the mouth, leading to systemic complications. Without antibiotics or surgical extraction, a dental abscess could become life-threatening. Such conditions might develop in midlife rather than in advanced age, truncating lifespan before prolonged senescence became common. Nutritional transitions also influenced adult resilience. Seasonal shortages could lead to periodic undernutrition. Repeated cycles of weight loss and recovery impose metabolic strain. Micronutrient deficiencies affect immune function and wound healing. Even when caloric intake was sufficient overall, imbalances in vitamins and minerals could weaken long-term health. These cumulative stresses do not always leave clear skeletal signatures, yet they shape survival probabilities across decades. Returning to the African environments where Homo sapiens first evolved highlights the continuity of these pressures. For nearly 300,000 years, adults engaged in physically demanding subsistence without technological buffers to reduce strain. There were no mechanized tools to lighten loads, no ergonomic adjustments, no chronic disease management systems. Survival required endurance sustained over many seasons. In such contexts, the body often reached its limits in midlife rather than in extended old age. The rarity of a large elderly population was reinforced not only by sudden trauma, but by the accumulation of mechanical and physiological wear. Aging did occur biologically, yet the pathway to experience it fully across many decades was narrow. Many adults encountered thresholds of strain, infection, or nutritional stress that ended life before advanced age became widespread. Illness in prehistoric life was rarely categorized as chronic disease in the way we understand it today. Instead, many conditions that would now be managed over decades likely unfolded more quickly and with fewer opportunities for intervention. Infections that might be treated with antibiotics in the modern world could escalate rapidly in small, mobile communities. A respiratory infection could progress to pneumonia. A gastrointestinal illness could lead to dehydration severe enough to threaten survival. Without controlled sanitation, access to clean water was uncertain, and contamination could occur at multiple points during daily subsistence. In such circumstances, the line between temporary illness and fatal outcome was thin. The immune system is powerful, yet it is not infallible. Age itself gradually alters immune response, but in prehistoric settings, repeated exposure to pathogens combined with nutritional stress could compromise resilience even in midlife. Adults who had already endured years of physical labor and periodic scarcity might face infection with reduced capacity to recover. The absence of medical infrastructure meant that survival depended almost entirely on the body's innate defenses and the supportive care of others. If fever rose beyond a certain point or infection spread systemically, options were limited. Many lives likely ended during episodes that, in a modern hospital, would be considered treatable. Parasites added another persistent burden. Intestinal worms and other parasitic infections can remain in the body for extended periods, gradually weakening nutritional status. Chronic parasitic load reduces iron levels, impairs growth, and diminishes immune efficiency. In prehistoric environments where exposure to soil, water, and animal hosts was constant, parasitic infections were likely common. While not always immediately fatal, their cumulative effects could shorten lifespan indirectly by increasing vulnerability to other diseases. Such hidden burdens rarely leave dramatic skeletal traces, yet they shape demographic patterns across generations. Social transmission of disease also influenced adult survival. Even in small bands, close proximity facilitates the spread of pathogens. A single contagious illness could move through a group sequentially. Although small population size limited the scale of epidemics compared to later agricultural societies, localized outbreaks could still have serious impact. If several adults became ill simultaneously, the group's capacity to secure food and provide care diminished. In fragile ecological settings, such disruptions could cascade into further mortality. Returning to the deep African past reminds us that these biological dynamics operated continuously for nearly 300,000 years. There were no vaccination programs, no antimicrobial treatments, no systematic disease surveillance. Each generation navigated infection with only the tools of innate immunity and communal support. In this long context, many adults likely died from illnesses that modern medicine has rendered survivable. The rarity of widespread old age was therefore reinforced not only by visible trauma and mechanical wear, but by the quiet persistence of infectious disease. Aging as a prolonged decline remained uncommon because many lives were interrupted by acute or subacute illness before advanced senescence could unfold across decades. The demographic youthfulness of early humanity was sustained in part by pathogens that operated invisibly yet persistently within the environments where our species began. Reproduction shaped the human life course in ways that quietly limited how often individuals reached advanced age. In early Homo sapiens communities, fertility began relatively soon after puberty. The transition from adolescence to adulthood carried immediate social and biological consequences. Forming partnerships, bearing children, and contributing to subsistence were not delayed into a prolonged period of education or economic preparation. Life unfolded within a compressed arc in which reproductive years occupied a central and often extended portion of adulthood. This structure influenced both female and male survival patterns. For women, pregnancy and childbirth represented recurring physiological demands. Gestation requires substantial metabolic investment. Lactation extends that investment for months or years. In environments characterized by fluctuating food availability, the energetic cost of reproduction could be significant. Repeated pregnancies, especially when spaced closely together due to high infant mortality, increase strain on the body. Each pregnancy carried risk of hemorrhage, obstructed labor, infection, or other complications. Without surgical intervention or antiseptic practices, these risks were not rare anomalies. They were embedded within the reproductive process itself. Over multiple births, cumulative strain could reduce the likelihood of surviving into later decades. Male life courses were shaped differently but were not free of reproductive pressure. Males often competed for status, mates, and resources. Hunting large game, engaging in physical confrontation, and asserting territorial presence increased exposure to injury. While cooperation was central to human survival, competition also formed part of social dynamics. Young and middle-aged men may have faced elevated risk through high-stakes activities tied to reproductive opportunity. These risks did not necessarily increase biological aging, but they increased mortality before advanced age became common. The timing of reproduction also influenced generational overlap. When individuals began having children in their late teens or early 20s, the span between generations shortened. A person who became a parent at 20 could become a grandparent in their early 40s. Yet becoming a great-grandparent required survival into the 60s or beyond, a threshold fewer individuals crossed. The demographic ladder narrowed with each additional decade. Early reproduction thus interacted with environmental hazards to compress generational depth. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests that birth intervals varied, depending on breastfeeding duration and nutritional status. Extended breastfeeding can suppress ovulation, spacing births naturally. However, high infant mortality often led to shortened intervals, as the cessation of lactation after infant death restored fertility. This cycle increased the number of pregnancies a woman might experience over her lifetime, amplifying cumulative risk. Over many generations, this pattern limited the proportion of women who survived long past their reproductive years. Returning to the African origins of our species reinforces how long this reproductive structure persisted. For nearly 300,000 years, human life unfolded without modern contraception, obstetric care, or medical management of complications. Reproduction was central to social organization and survival, but it carried inherent biological cost. The human body evolved to balance fertility with maintenance, yet that balance did not prioritize decades of post-reproductive longevity for the majority. The rarity of widespread old age was therefore intertwined with the demands of sustaining new life. In deep human history, reproduction was not only the mechanism of continuity, it was also one of the forces that constrained how many individuals would grow old. The biological cost of reproduction did not end with childbirth. Parenting in early human societies required sustained physical and cognitive investment. Infants and young children are unusually dependent compared to the offspring of many other mammals. They require years of protection, nourishment, and social learning before they can contribute meaningfully to subsistence. This extended dependency is a defining feature of Homo sapiens, yet the burden of supporting that dependency fell on adults whose own survival remained uncertain. The years spent raising children overlapped with the years when physical resilience began to decline gradually. In environments shaped by fluctuating resources and constant mobility, parenting added cumulative strain to bodies already engaged in demanding tasks. Women often carried infants while gathering food or traveling between camps. Lactation increased caloric requirements. If food availability declined, maternal nutritional reserves could be depleted. Even after weaning, childcare remained labor-intensive. Protecting children from environmental hazards, teaching them skills, and integrating them into social networks required time and energy. These investments enhanced offspring survival, yet they also extended the period during which adults faced heightened responsibility and physical stress. For men, provisioning roles often intensified during child-rearing years. Hunting larger or more dangerous prey could improve nutritional intake for dependent children, yet increased hunting effort also raised exposure to injury. The overlap between peak reproductive responsibility and peak subsistence activity created a period of life marked by high output and high risk. Adults who navigated this phase successfully might reach middle age with experience and knowledge, but many did not reach decades far beyond it. Demographic modeling of small-scale societies suggests that adult mortality remained significant even after childhood hazards were passed. The probability of surviving from age 15 to age 60 was far lower in prehistoric contexts than in most modern populations. Each successive decade reduced cohort size. By the time individuals approached what we would call late adulthood, only a fraction of the original group remained. Reproduction, while essential to species continuity, therefore interacted with environmental hazards to limit the proportion of people who could experience extended old age. The human reproductive pattern also influenced the distribution of caregiving across generations. In some evolutionary models, grandmothers contribute significantly to childcare and food gathering, indirectly enhancing the survival of grandchildren. This contribution may have supported the evolution of somewhat extended female lifespan compared to other primates. Yet, even if such dynamics operated, they functioned within small demographic margins. The presence of some long-lived grandmothers does not imply a large elderly class. It suggests selective advantages for a minority who survive the cumulative risks of pregnancy, childbirth, infection, and environmental stress. Returning to the long African baseline reminds us that these patterns persisted across nearly 300,000 years. The rhythm of early human life was anchored in reproduction and child-rearing under conditions of uncertainty. The energy directed towards sustaining new generations inevitably constrained the energy available for long-term bodily maintenance. In this balance, survival into advanced age remained possible but statistically limited. The rarity of widespread old age was therefore inseparable from the biological and social demands of raising children in demanding environments. Reproduction also shaped the timing of life in a way that compressed expectations about aging. In early Homo sapiens communities, the transition from childhood to reproductive maturity occurred without long institutional delays. Puberty marked entry into roles that carried immediate consequences for survival and continuity. Because fertility began relatively early, the interval between generations was short. A young woman who bore her first child around the age of 20 could see that child reach adolescence while she was still in her 30s. If that child reproduced at a similar age, a grandparent might be only in their 40s. This rapid generational turnover meant that life stages unfolded quickly. Yet for a substantial class of elders to become common, two conditions had to be met repeatedly. Individuals had to survive the demands of reproduction, and they had to persist for decades beyond it. In prehistoric environments, both conditions were uncertain. The cumulative strain of pregnancy, childbirth, lactation, and childcare reduced female survival probabilities over time. For males, the risks associated with provisioning, territorial defense, and social competition also accumulated across early and middle adulthood. Each reproductive cycle extended the period of physical exposure to hazard. Survival into advanced age therefore required not only biological resilience, but also repeated avoidance of environmental and social risks over many decades. The demographic consequences were predictable. If a cohort began with a high number of births, then lost many in infancy, then lost additional members through adult hazards tied to subsistence and reproduction, only a small remainder would reach later decades. Even if those individuals contributed meaningfully as knowledge holders or caregivers, their numbers remained limited. The structure of the population thus remained centered on youth and active adulthood rather than on prolonged elderhood. Anthropological comparisons with recent small-scale societies provide indirect insight into this pattern. In groups where reproduction begins early and continues through much of adulthood, generational overlap can be present but shallow. The presence of grandparents does not imply a large elderly demographic layer. It reflects survival through multiple demographic filters. For most of deep human history, these filters were strong. Returning to the African origins of Homo sapiens reinforces how long this reproductive structure persisted. For nearly 300,000 years, there were no reliable means to control fertility or mitigate obstetric risk. The biological design of the human pelvis, the energetic demands of lactation, and the vulnerability of infants combined to anchor adulthood around reproduction. The body was shaped to balance fertility with survival long enough to raise offspring. It was not shaped in a context where most individuals would experience extended decades of post-reproductive life. In this light, the rarity of widespread old age becomes more comprehensible. The early human life course moved swiftly from dependency to productivity to vulnerability. Reproduction ensured continuity, yet it also intensified exposure to risk across the very decades that might otherwise have led into prolonged aging. For the vast majority of human history, the demands of bringing new life into uncertain environments were inseparable from the limits placed on how many individuals would live long enough to become old. The archaeological record offers one of the clearest ways to examine how often individuals reached advanced age in deep human history. Bones endure long after soft tissues disappear, and within those bones are traces of lived experience. Anthropologists estimate age at death by examining dental wear, the fusion of growth plates, changes in the pelvis, and patterns of joint degeneration. These methods are not perfect, but when applied across many individuals, they reveal broad demographic patterns. In prehistoric burial sites associated with early Homo sapiens and other late Pleistocene populations, a consistent pattern emerges. Many individuals died in infancy, childhood, or early adulthood, and comparatively fewer reached what would be categorized as old age. Cemeteries from Upper Paleolithic contexts across Africa and Eurasia provide examples of this structure. Juvenile remains are common. Young adults appear frequently. Individuals identified as over 60 are present, yet they form a small proportion of the total sample. This distribution does not imply that people were incapable of living longer. It indicates that the pathway to advanced age was statistically narrow. The bones of older individuals often show clear signs of degenerative change. Arthritic joints, spinal compression, and extensive tooth wear testify to years of physical labor and dietary grit. Some skeletons reveal healed fractures that suggest long-term survival after injury, implying care within the group. These findings confirm that elderly individuals did exist. However, their relative scarcity within burial assemblages aligns with demographic models of populations shaped by high early mortality and ongoing adult risk. The archaeological evidence therefore supports the idea that old age was present but uncommon. Burial practices themselves provide additional context. In some prehistoric sites, individuals were interred with objects, pigments, or careful positioning, suggesting social recognition. The inclusion of elderly individuals within such practices indicates that age did not exclude someone from communal identity. Yet the small number of such burials reinforces the demographic reality that elders formed a minority. A society can respect age without being numerically dominated by it. Taphonomic factors must also be considered. Not all individuals who died were preserved or excavated. Some remains may have been lost to erosion, scavenging, or incomplete archaeological recovery. Even accounting for these limitations, the recurring pattern across multiple sites and regions suggests that advanced age was not widespread. When skeletal samples consistently show a concentration of deaths in younger age categories, the broader demographic picture becomes clearer. Returning to the African origins of our species anchors these findings in long timescales. For nearly 300,000 years, human life unfolded without modern medicine or sanitation. The bones recovered from prehistoric contexts represent only fragments of that span, yet they offer consistent signals. Most individuals did not accumulate the full skeletal signatures of advanced senescence because many did not live long enough for those changes to become extreme. The archaeological record, therefore, aligns with ecological and biological evidence. Old age existed, but it did not define the demographic center of early humanity. The absence of a large elderly population is written not only in theory, but in the distribution of ancient bones. Estimating age from skeletal remains requires careful interpretation, and this process itself reveals how uncommon advanced age appears in prehistoric samples. Age at death is inferred from multiple indicators rather than a single marker. In children and adolescents, dental eruption and bone growth plates provide relatively precise information. In adults, however, age estimation becomes more complex. Anthropologists examine the wear patterns on teeth, the surface changes of the pubic symphysis, cranial suture closure, and degenerative changes in joints. These indicators shift gradually, and their interpretation relies on comparison with modern reference populations. When applied across assemblages, they create approximate age categories such as young adult, middle adult, and older adult. Across many late Pleistocene and early Holocene sites, the distribution of these categories follows a similar pattern. There is a noticeable concentration of individuals in young and middle adulthood, with fewer confidently assigned to advanced age. Even allowing for error margins in age estimation, the trend remains consistent. The skeletal features associated with older adulthood, such as severe joint degeneration or extensive cranial suture closure, are present but not dominant. This pattern aligns with demographic expectations for populations experiencing high mortality earlier in life. It suggests that while some individuals survived into later decades, they did not constitute a large proportion of the community. Skeletal preservation also shapes interpretation. Older individuals may have had more brittle bones, potentially reducing preservation quality. However, juvenile bones are often even more fragile, yet they are still found in significant numbers in many sites. The relative frequency of juvenile and young adult remains compared to elderly remains supports the view that early mortality was common. Moreover, repeated patterns across geographically distant regions strengthen the conclusion. From African sites associated with early Homo sapiens to Eurasian Upper Paleolithic contexts, age-at-death profiles frequently show a pyramid-like structure rather than a rectangular one. Evidence of long-term survival after injury provides nuance. Some skeletons display healed fractures of limbs, ribs, or even cranial trauma, indicating that injured individuals were cared for and survived long enough for bone remodeling. This demonstrates that prehistoric communities were capable of supporting members through periods of vulnerability. Yet even with such support, the number of skeletons clearly exhibiting decades of advanced degeneration remains relatively small. Care extended life in individual cases, but it did not transform the overall demographic structure into one dominated by elders. Returning to the deep African origins of our species clarifies the continuity of these findings. For most of human existence, life unfolded under environmental and biological constraints that limited how many individuals reached late adulthood. The skeletal record, despite its incompleteness, repeatedly reflects this limitation. Old age is visible in the bones, but it occupies the margins rather than the center of prehistoric age distributions. The archaeological evidence, therefore, reinforces the broader argument. Aging occurred, yet a widespread elderly class did not characterize most of human history. While skeletal evidence shows that some individuals survived into later decades, the broader archaeological context reveals how exceptional those cases often were. In many prehistoric burial grounds, the number of individuals identified as clearly elderly remains small relative to total interments. Even when using cautious age categories such as over 50 or older adult, the proportion rarely approaches the levels seen in modern populations. This recurring pattern across different regions and time periods suggests that limited elder representation was not an isolated anomaly, but a structural feature of early human demography. Burial contexts also provide insight into social recognition of age. In certain sites, older individuals appear to have been treated with care in death, sometimes buried with tools, ornaments, or pigments. These practices imply that age did not diminish social belonging. However, respectful burial does not equate to numerical prevalence. A community may value its elders deeply even if only a few individuals reach that stage. The rarity of elderly remains, combined with evidence of care, suggests that old age was meaningful precisely because it was uncommon. From a demographic perspective, this scarcity can be visualized as a narrow apex atop a wide base. High birth rates and significant juvenile mortality created a broad lower layer. Adult hazards further reduced cohort size. By the time individuals approached their 6th or 7th decade, only a small fraction of the original birth group remained. This structure contrasts sharply with the rectangular age distribution seen in many contemporary societies, where survival into advanced age is common and predictable. The archaeological record thus captures not only individual lifespans, but also the shape of entire populations. It is important to acknowledge limitations. Preservation bias, incomplete excavation, and methodological uncertainty all influence skeletal samples. Not every death left recoverable remains. Not every burial has been discovered. Even so, when independent sites across continents reveal similar age-at-death distributions, the pattern gains strength. The repeated underrepresentation of elderly individuals aligns with ecological and biological evidence discussed earlier. It suggests that the rarity of old age was not merely theoretical but materially reflected in human remains. Returning to the deep African origins of Homo sapiens emphasizes how long this demographic pattern persisted. For nearly 300,000 years, small mobile groups navigated environments without modern medical support. The skeletal fragments we recover today represent only a fraction of that immense time span, yet they echo a consistent theme. Aging occurred, but it did not dominate the population structure. Elders existed, and some survived long enough to accumulate visible degenerative changes. However, their numbers remained limited. The archaeological record, therefore, provides a quiet confirmation of the broader argument. For most of human history, old age was not absent, but it was uncommon enough that societies were not numerically shaped around it. The bones themselves preserve this demographic truth. When we shift from bones to social structure, another dimension of the absence of widespread old age becomes visible. In small hunter-gatherer bands, which resemble the social organization of early Homo sapiens, the number of individuals in each age category shaped how roles were distributed. If only a few members of a group reached advanced age, their social position differed from that of elders in a society where they formed a large demographic layer. The structure of authority, knowledge transmission, and daily labor was influenced not only by cultural values but by numerical proportions. In a community of 30 or 40 individuals, a single elder represented a rare repository of long-term memory rather than the head of a large generational cohort. Ethnographic observations of recent foraging societies offer cautious analogies. In many such groups, older adults contribute through storytelling, mediation of disputes, childcare, and specialized knowledge of landscapes and resources. Their experience carries weight, yet decision-making often remains relatively egalitarian. Authority is not concentrated solely in age, partly because age itself is not numerically dominant. When elders are few, leadership structures tend to remain distributed among competent adults in their prime years. This pattern may resemble aspects of early Homo sapiens societies, where survival required collaboration among physically capable individuals. Mobility further shaped the social role of age. Frequent movement across territories limited the development of fixed hierarchies tied to property or inherited status. In highly mobile groups, social cohesion depended on cooperation rather than rigid stratification. If elders were relatively rare, they were integrated into this flexible structure rather than forming a distinct governing class. Their influence derived from experience rather than from demographic majority. The absence of a large elderly population therefore influenced not only survival statistics, but also the architecture of social organization. Generational layering in such communities was shallow. Parents and children formed the core of daily interaction. Grandparents were present in some cases, but great-grandparental overlap was uncommon. The rhythm of knowledge transfer adapted to this compression. Skills in hunting, gathering, tool production, and navigation had to be transmitted while adults were still active and physically engaged. There was little expectation of decades devoted primarily to reflection after productive labor ended. Social planning operated within shorter time horizons because demographic turnover was faster. Returning to the African origins of our species emphasizes how long this pattern persisted. For nearly 300,000 years, human groups remained small and mobile. The demographic pyramid described earlier influenced not only who survived, but how societies were structured. A community dominated numerically by youth and early adulthood naturally centered its institutions around those stages of life. Elders were respected but not numerous enough to define the majority experience. In this context, old age did not become a broad social category with specialized institutions. It remained an individual stage achieved by some, not a widespread phase anticipated by most. The social world of early humanity was therefore shaped by the rarity of elders as much as by their presence. The limited number of elders in early human groups also influenced how memory and tradition were preserved. In societies without writing, continuity depends on living carriers of knowledge. Oral transmission requires individuals who have witnessed past events, remembered seasonal cycles, and retained technical skills. Yet if only a small fraction of the population survives into later decades, the chain of memory rests on relatively few shoulders. This does not diminish its strength, but it changes its scale. Knowledge must be distributed early and widely because there is no guarantee that a particular elder will remain present for many years. In such conditions, learning is embedded within daily practice rather than deferred to prolonged post-productive years. Anthropological studies of contemporary foraging societies show that children begin participating in subsistence activities from a young age. They observe, imitate, and gradually assume responsibility. Instruction often occurs through shared work rather than formal lessons. If generational overlap is limited, this distributed model of learning becomes essential. Skills in tracking, plant identification, tool-making, and navigation must be mastered before physical decline begins. There is little room for a lengthy retirement phase devoted solely to teaching. The rarity of a large elder class encourages continuity through active participation rather than hierarchical preservation. Social authority follows a similar pattern. In populations where elders are few, leadership tends to be situational and competence-based. An experienced hunter may guide decisions related to game movement. A knowledgeable gatherer may direct choices about plant resources. Age confers respect, yet it does not automatically create a permanent ruling tier. The demographic structure reinforces flexibility. When elders are not numerous, they cannot form a majority bloc shaping every institutional decision. Instead, influence circulates among capable adults across overlapping age ranges. Mobility further supports this pattern. In small groups moving through varied African landscapes, social cohesion required adaptability. Long-term accumulation of wealth or property was limited by the need to travel light. Inheritance systems, as seen in later agricultural societies, had not yet solidified. Without large stores of material goods, there was less incentive to build elaborate age-based hierarchies. The demographic youthfulness of the population aligned with this fluid structure. Most individuals were engaged in active subsistence rather than prolonged retirement. Returning to the long time span of early Homo sapiens emphasizes the durability of this arrangement. For nearly 300,000 years, the majority of human communities operated without a large elderly demographic layer. Knowledge, transmission, leadership, and cooperation evolved within this youth-centered structure. Elders were present and valued, but they were numerically limited. The social architecture of early humanity was therefore shaped by a compressed generational span. Old age did not form a broad institutional category because the population did not contain enough elderly individuals to sustain such a category. The structure of memory and authority adapted to this demographic reality. When a population contains only a small number of elders, time itself is experienced differently. In communities dominated numerically by children, adolescents, and adults in their productive years, the visible rhythm of life emphasizes growth, learning, labor, and reproduction. The horizon of expectation does not naturally extend into long decades of post-productive living because few individuals embody that stage. Old age, when it appears, is familiar yet uncommon. It is observed in specific people rather than anticipated as a universal destination. This demographic texture influences how societies imagine continuity. In small, mobile groups resembling early Homo sapiens bands, continuity rests less on accumulated institutional memory and more on ongoing participation. A hunting technique is preserved not because it is archived, but because it is practiced repeatedly by active adults. Knowledge of water sources is maintained not through written maps, but through shared journeys. When elders are few, tradition survives by being enacted across age groups rather than stored within a large retired generation. The absence of a broad elderly layer therefore reinforces a culture of active transmission rather than passive preservation. This pattern also shapes emotional expectations. In a society where many individuals do not survive into advanced age, death in midlife is not extraordinary. It is part of the demographic landscape. The presence of a 70-year-old would likely command respect, yet such a figure would stand out precisely because survival to that point required navigating multiple layers of risk. The rarity of extended aging may have intensified the symbolic weight of elderhood without expanding its numerical scale. Old age becomes visible and meaningful, but not demographically central. Returning to the African origins of Homo sapiens clarifies the durability of this structure. For nearly 300,000 years, human groups lived in environments without the demographic stability produced by modern medicine. Population pyramids remained steep, with wide bases and narrow peaks. Social systems evolved within this shape. Institutions such as formal retirement, age-based entitlement, or large intergenerational households with multiple elderly members could not emerge in populations where elders were relatively scarce. Instead, social cohesion depended on overlapping layers of active adulthood. Even when individuals reached their 60s, they often remained engaged in daily tasks, adjusting roles gradually rather than withdrawing into a prolonged separate phase. The boundary between adulthood and old age was likely fluid rather than sharply defined. Because few lived long enough to experience extended frailty, aging did not form a long, distinct chapter in most lives. The demographic youthfulness of early humanity therefore shaped not only survival statistics, but the lived experience of time, authority, and continuity. Old age was part of the human possibility, yet it remained a marginal demographic presence. For most of our species' history, society was not organized around elders in large numbers. It was organized around those still actively navigating the demands of survival. The shift from foraging to agriculture marked one of the most significant transitions in human history, yet it did not immediately create a world filled with elders. When humans began cultivating plants and domesticating animals around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago in multiple regions, including parts of the Near East and later Africa and Asia, the structure of daily life changed profoundly. Permanent settlements emerged. Population densities increased. Food production became more predictable in some seasons. It might seem logical to assume that these changes would quickly extend lifespan and produce a larger elderly population. The evidence, however, suggests a more complex outcome. Early agricultural communities often experienced new health challenges. Reliance on a limited number of staple crops reduced dietary diversity. Diets high in certain grains but low in varied micronutrients sometimes led to deficiencies that weakened immune systems and affected growth. Archaeological studies of early farming populations frequently reveal signs of nutritional stress, including enamel hypoplasia in teeth, which indicates episodes of childhood malnutrition. While agriculture allowed more people to survive infancy in some contexts, it also introduced vulnerabilities that influenced adult health. Sedentary life altered disease dynamics. Permanent settlements facilitated closer contact among individuals and between humans and domesticated animals. Pathogens could circulate more easily in denser populations. Zoonotic diseases, those transmitted from animals to humans, became more common as livestock were incorporated into daily life. Although large-scale epidemics would become more pronounced in later urban civilizations, even early villages experienced higher disease burdens than small mobile foraging bands. Increased exposure to pathogens did not necessarily extend lifespan. In many cases, it may have offset gains from more stable food supplies. Skeletal remains from early agricultural sites often show increased evidence of infectious disease and joint stress compared to some foraging populations. Repetitive labor associated with farming, digging, planting, grinding grain placed sustained strain on the body. Signs of degenerative joint disease appear in many early farming skeletons. While some individuals reach middle and later adulthood, the demographic profile remained weighted toward younger ages. The introduction of agriculture increased total population size, but it did not instantly transform the age pyramid into one dominated by elders. Returning to the long timeline of Homo sapiens highlights how brief this agricultural period is relative to the full span of our existence. For nearly 300,000 years, humans lived as foragers. Agriculture occupies only the last fraction of that timeline. Even within this more recent era, the majority of people in early farming societies still face significant mortality from infection, childbirth complications, and nutritional stress. Old age became somewhat more common in certain contexts, yet it remained far from universal. The emergence of agriculture did begin to lay groundwork for demographic change by enabling larger, more stable communities. However, the transition did not erase the deep biological and ecological constraints that had shaped human survival for millennia. The rarity of widespread old age persisted, even as the social landscape shifted towards settled life. When early agricultural villages expanded into larger settlements, the demographic picture became more layered, yet the presence of widespread old age still remained limited. Population size increased because more food could be produced from the same land area. Fields of wheat, barley, millet, or rice supported denser communities than wild plant gathering alone. Over time, villages grew into proto-towns. From a distance, this growth suggests stability. Yet beneath that stability were new patterns of stress that continued to constrain how many individuals reached advanced age. Sedentary life altered the human relationship to waste and water. In mobile foraging groups, waste was left behind as camps moved. In permanent settlements, waste accumulated. Human and animal excrement collected near living spaces. Wells and surface water sources could become contaminated. These environmental changes created conditions favorable for the spread of waterborne and parasitic diseases. Dysentery, intestinal infections, and other gastrointestinal illnesses likely became more frequent. Such diseases disproportionately affected children, but they also weakened adults. Even if agricultural communities produced more calories overall, repeated exposure to pathogens could reduce the number of individuals surviving into late adulthood. Diet, while more predictable, often became less varied. Reliance on staple grains provided steady carbohydrate intake, but sometimes reduced access to diverse micronutrients found in wild plants and varied animal sources. Archaeological analyses of skeletal remains from early farming populations show increased evidence of iron deficiency anemia in some regions, visible as porous lesions in cranial bones. Shorter average stature compared to some earlier foraging populations suggests episodes of developmental stress. These indicators point to nutritional challenges that persisted despite agricultural abundance. A stable food supply does not automatically translate into optimal health across decades. The nature of labor also shifted. Farming required repetitive tasks tied to planting, harvesting, irrigation, and grain processing. Grinding grain with stone tools imposed continuous stress on shoulders, elbows, and wrists. Clearing fields and managing livestock required sustained physical exertion. Over years, this repetitive strain produced degenerative joint changes. Skeletal evidence from early agricultural sites often reveals arthritis and spinal compression consistent with heavy labor. While some individuals survived into middle and later adulthood, their bodies bore signs of cumulative wear that could limit longevity. The development of larger settlements also facilitated new forms of social stratification. Access to resources could become uneven. Some individuals may have enjoyed better nutrition and protection, while others experienced scarcity or marginalization. This inequality could influence survival probabilities across age groups. In hierarchical societies, certain roles might expose individuals to conflict or exploitation. Increasing adult mortality, the social complexity that accompanied agriculture did not uniformly extend lifespan. It redistributed risk in new ways. Urbanization intensified these patterns. As villages grew into early cities, population density rose dramatically. Close quarters amplified the transmission of infectious diseases. While agriculture supported larger total populations, it also created ecological niches for pathogens to circulate continuously. Historical evidence from later ancient civilizations shows frequent outbreaks of disease that limited average lifespan. Even in the Roman Empire, for example, life expectancy at birth remained relatively low due to high infant mortality and recurrent epidemics. Though some individuals lived into their 60s or 70s, they were not the demographic majority. Returning to the broader timeline clarifies perspective. Agriculture began only about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, a brief interval compared to the nearly 300,000 years of Homo sapiens' existence. For most of this agricultural period, medical knowledge remained limited. Sanitation systems were rudimentary or absent. Vaccination and antibiotics lay far in the future. While agriculture increased total population size and sometimes stabilized food supply, it did not eliminate the biological and ecological filters that had long restricted survival into advanced age. Mortality remained concentrated in infancy and early adulthood. Adult hazards shifted from hunting injuries to infectious disease and labor-related strain, but they did not disappear. Over time, incremental improvements in housing, storage, and social organization may have modestly increased the proportion of elders in some regions. Yet the overall demographic pyramid remained steep compared to modern standards. Old age became somewhat more visible as communities grew, but it did not become a common life stage for the majority. The transition to agriculture therefore represents an important step in the long path toward demographic aging, but it was not a decisive turning point. The deep patterns established in Africa during the long foraging era, high early mortality, adult hazard, and biological trade-offs continued to shape populations. Even in settled societies, the pathway to advanced age remained narrow. The world was changing, but the rarity of widespread old age persisted across much of human history. As agricultural societies matured and spread across continents, gradual shifts in population structure did occur, yet they unfolded slowly and unevenly. In some regions, improved storage methods such as granaries helped buffer seasonal shortages. Irrigation systems stabilized crop yields in fertile river valleys. Domesticated animals provided milk, meat, and secondary products. These developments could increase survival rates for certain segments of the population. However, even with these advances, the demographic pyramid did not immediately transform into one dominated by elders. Mortality patterns continued to reflect both inherited biological constraints and newly emerging environmental pressures. Written records from later ancient civilizations provide indirect evidence of age distribution. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, inscriptions occasionally mention individuals who lived into their 70s or 80s. These cases are notable precisely because they are exceptional. Most demographic reconstructions of ancient populations suggest life expectancy at birth often remained in the 20s or 30s, heavily influenced by infant mortality. If individuals survive childhood, they might live into their 50s or early 60s. Yet large segments of the population did not reach those ages. Warfare, famine, and epidemic disease repeatedly interrupted generational continuity. The presence of some long-lived individuals did not equate to a broad, stable, elderly demographic. Urban centers intensified risk in distinctive ways. Crowded housing facilitated respiratory infections. Trade routes connected distant populations, enabling pathogens to spread over larger areas. Historical plagues, though later than the earliest agricultural phases, illustrate how disease could sharply reduce life expectancy even in relatively advanced societies. Each epidemic compressed the age structure anew, reducing the proportion of older adults. While agriculture supported larger total populations, it also created vulnerability to rapid demographic contraction. Social and economic structures also influenced survival into old age. In stratified societies, elites sometimes enjoyed better nutrition and protection, increasing their chances of longevity. Skeletal evidence from certain ancient cemeteries suggests variation in health markers between social classes. Yet even among privileged groups, mortality from infection and limited medical intervention remained significant. The majority of people in agricultural and early urban societies continued to experience lifespans constrained by factors familiar from earlier eras: disease, childbirth complications, injury, and nutritional fluctuation. When viewed across the long arc of human history, the agricultural era occupies only the most recent portion of our timeline. For nearly 90% of our existence, humans lived as foragers in small groups. The agricultural revolution began altering demographic patterns, but it did so gradually. It laid foundations for future increases in survival, particularly by enabling larger populations and more complex social organization. Yet the deep structure of high early mortality and ongoing adult hazard persisted for millennia. The number of individuals reaching advanced age may have increased slightly in some contexts, but old age still did not become a universal life stage. Returning to the central question clarifies this trajectory. The shift to farming marked an important step in human social evolution, but it did not immediately erase the demographic realities established over hundreds of thousands of years. The rarity of widespread old age remained a defining feature of most agricultural societies. Only much later, with improvements in sanitation, public health, and medical science, would the demographic pyramid begin to widen at the top. Until that point, even settled civilizations continued to reflect the long human past in which aging was biologically possible, but demographically uncommon. The emergence of large cities introduced a new phase in human demographic history. Yet it did not immediately create societies dominated by elders. When settlements expanded into urban centers in regions such as Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus Basin, and later across parts of China and the Mediterranean, population density reached levels unseen in earlier foraging or village life. Walls enclosed neighborhoods, markets connected strangers, trade routes linked distant communities. On the surface, such complexity might suggest improved survival through specialization and organization. Yet, urbanization brought with it a concentration of risk that continued to limit how many individuals reached advanced age. Dense populations facilitated the continuous circulation of infectious disease. Unlike small mobile bands where pathogens could fade out as groups dispersed, cities allowed microbes to persist. Close living quarters, shared water sources, and limited sanitation created environments where respiratory and gastrointestinal infections spread efficiently. Archaeological and historical evidence from ancient urban centers frequently shows signs of epidemic disease. Even when outbreaks were not catastrophic, recurrent illness increased mortality across age groups. Children remained vulnerable, but adults were also affected. A society can produce monumental architecture and written records while still maintaining a relatively youthful age structure. The labor demands of urban economies also shaped survival. Construction of walls, temples, irrigation systems, and roads required sustained physical effort. Agricultural surplus supported specialized craftspeople, yet many citizens still engaged in manual labor. Repetitive strain and workplace injuries persisted, now in new forms tied to urban production. The cumulative effect of these stresses limited the proportion of individuals who could advance into extended old age. Even in literate societies that recorded the lives of kings and officials, the majority of ordinary people likely experienced lifespans shaped by infection, injury, and nutritional variation. Historical demography provides additional perspective. In the Roman Empire, one of the best documented ancient societies, life expectancy at birth is estimated to have been low by modern standards, heavily influenced by high infant mortality. Surviving into one's 50s or 60s was possible, but not typical. Inscriptions honoring individuals who lived into their 70s or 80s are present, yet their rarity stands out. The presence of some long-lived elites did not transform the demographic pyramid into one with a broad upper tier. The same pattern appears in other ancient civilizations. Longevity existed, but it did not characterize the majority. Urban life also intensified social inequality. Access to cleaner water, better food, and safer housing often varied by status. Elites might have enjoyed somewhat higher survival rates, while laborers and marginalized groups faced greater risk. Such disparities could create pockets of longer life within a generally youthful population. Yet even among privileged groups, recurrent epidemics and limited medical knowledge constrained survival. The broader age structure remained steep compared to modern societies. Returning to the deep timeline of Homo sapiens emphasizes how recent urbanization truly is. Cities have existed for only a few thousand years, a brief moment relative to nearly 300,000 years of human existence. The biological and ecological patterns established during the long foraging era continued to influence survival. Urban complexity did not erase them, it rearranged them. Old age may have become more visible in certain households, particularly among elites, but it did not become a universal stage anticipated by most citizens. The demographic weight of youth and early adulthood persisted even within the walls of ancient cities. As urban civilizations matured, written records began to preserve individual lifespans, offering a clearer window into demographic reality. Legal documents, epitaphs, census fragments, and literary references from ancient societies reveal that while some people reached advanced ages, they did so within populations still shaped by high mortality. Inscriptions from Rome occasionally commemorate individuals in their 70s or 80s, yet such ages are often emphasized precisely because they were unusual. When a lifespan is repeatedly described as remarkable, it suggests that it was not typical. The average structure of the population remained weighted toward younger age groups. Even in relatively prosperous imperial periods, mortality from disease and environmental stress continued to restrict how many individuals would experience extended old age. Public health conditions in ancient cities were uneven. Some urban centers developed aqueducts, drainage systems, and bath complexes, which improved access to water and hygiene for portions of the population. Yet these infrastructures were not universally effective or evenly distributed. Waste disposal remained inconsistent, and crowding persisted. Respiratory infections, gastrointestinal diseases, and vector-borne illnesses continued to circulate. Periodic famines or supply disruptions further weakened populations. A single failed harvest or breakdown in trade could destabilize entire regions. These structural vulnerabilities repeatedly narrowed the age pyramid, reducing the number of people who survived into later decades. Warfare also played a significant role. Ancient states frequently engaged in military campaigns that removed large numbers of young and middle-aged men from the civilian population. Combat injuries, exposure, and post-conflict disease reduced survival rates among adults who might otherwise have reached older age. Even those who survived warfare could carry lasting injuries that limited long-term health. The demographic effects of repeated conflicts reinforced a youthful population structure. Each generation faced risks that interrupted the gradual progression toward advanced age. Economic and social roles further shaped survival. Labor-intensive occupations such as mining, construction, and agricultural fieldwork imposed sustained physical strain. Skeletal remains from certain ancient contexts revealed joint degeneration and trauma consistent with heavy labor. The cumulative impact of such work, combined with limited medical care, constrained how many individuals could endure into prolonged senescence. While elites might have enjoyed relative comfort and better nutrition, the majority of urban inhabitants experienced lives that remained physically demanding. Returning to the longer evolutionary frame clarifies the continuity of these patterns. Although cities represented a major social transformation, they did not immediately overturn the biological and ecological foundations established during the vast foraging era. For nearly 300,000 years before urbanization, human survival had been shaped by high early mortality and adult hazard. The first few thousand years of urban life were insufficient to reverse those deeply rooted dynamics. Even as administrative systems grew more sophisticated and record-keeping improved, the demographic profile remained steep. Old age existed, sometimes visibly and sometimes celebrated, but it did not define the majority experience. Urbanization introduced complexity, hierarchy, and cultural innovation, yet the rarity of widespread old age persisted. The human body and its vulnerabilities continued to interact with dense social environments in ways that limited how many individuals would live long enough to experience decades of gradual decline. The walls of cities did not yet guarantee longevity. Over time, ancient and medieval societies accumulated incremental improvements in housing, storage, and governance, yet the overall demographic structure remained shaped by vulnerability. Grain reserves could buffer short-term scarcity, but they could also attract pests and contamination. Trade networks moved food across distances, yet they also carried pathogens. Urban authorities sometimes attempted sanitation reforms, but without germ theory, the mechanisms of disease transmission remained poorly understood. Even where infrastructure improved, it rarely eliminated the cyclical forces that repeatedly reduced population size. Famine, epidemic, and conflict continued to compress age distributions across centuries. Medieval Europe offers a later example of this continuity. Parish records and burial data suggest that life expectancy at birth remained low, heavily influenced by infant mortality. Surviving into one's 50s was possible. Reaching 70 was uncommon. Periodic outbreaks such as the Black Death dramatically reduced the adult population, erasing entire cohorts and reshaping the demographic pyramid. In other regions of the world, similar cycles of epidemic disease and resource fluctuation limited the proportion of elders. Longevity existed in every era, but it did not become a common demographic expectation for the majority. Even where social institutions recognized stages of life, childhood, adulthood, elderhood, the numerical weight of those stages differed from modern societies. Extended multi-generational households existed, yet they often included only one or two elderly members rather than a broad tier of aging individuals. Economic production depended heavily on adults in their prime years. There was little concept of retirement as a prolonged withdrawal from labor. Many who survived into later decades continued working in reduced capacities until illness or frailty intervened. The boundary between adulthood and old age remained gradual and relatively brief. The persistence of infectious disease was central to this pattern. Before the development of modern public health systems, sanitation improvements were partial and uneven. Clean water access varied widely. Medical practice lacked effective treatments for bacterial infections. Even as societies developed complex legal codes and artistic traditions, the biological limits on survival remained substantial. A city might produce monumental architecture and written literature, yet still maintain a demographic profile dominated by youth and middle age. Returning to the full span of Homo sapiens history places these centuries in context. Agriculture and urbanization together cover only a small portion of the roughly 300,000 years since our species emerged in Africa. For the vast majority of that time, and even for much of recorded history, the combination of early mortality, adult hazard, and limited medical intervention constrained survival into advanced age. The idea of old age as a widespread, predictable life stage had not yet taken hold. The demographic pyramid remained steep across most civilizations. It would require a transformation in public health, sanitation, and medical science occurring only in the last few centuries to widen the top of that pyramid significantly. Until then, even complex societies continued to reflect the long human past in which aging was biologically possible but statistically uncommon. The transformation that finally widened the top of the demographic pyramid did not occur gradually across deep time. It accelerated within the last 2 centuries, a brief interval when measured against nearly 300,000 years of Homo sapiens existence. During this period, a combination of scientific discovery, public health reform, and technological innovation altered the fundamental conditions that had long constrained survival into advanced age. For most of human history, the rarity of old age had been sustained by high infant mortality, infectious disease, environmental hazard, and limited medical intervention. In the 19th and 20th centuries, several of these forces began to weaken simultaneously. One of the earliest and most influential shifts was the improvement of sanitation and water systems. The recognition that contaminated water spread disease led to the construction of sewage networks and protected wells in many urban centres. Clean water reduced the incidence of gastrointestinal infections that had long claimed the lives of children and weakened adults. As infant and child mortality declined, average life expectancy at birth began to rise. This demographic change alone significantly altered population structure. When more children survived into adulthood, the base of the pyramid narrowed more slowly, allowing larger cohorts to progress into later decades. Vaccination further transformed survival patterns. The introduction of smallpox inoculation and later widespread immunization campaigns reduced mortality from diseases that had historically caused recurring epidemics. While vaccination did not eliminate all infectious threats, it prevented many early deaths and stabilized population growth. As successive cohorts avoided fatal childhood illnesses, the number of individuals reaching middle and later adulthood increased. This change did not instantly produce a society filled with elders, but it set in motion a widening of the upper age tiers that had rarely been seen before. The development of germ theory in the 19th century provided a conceptual framework for controlling infection. Antiseptic surgical practices, improved hospital hygiene, and later the discovery of antibiotics dramatically increased survival following injury and bacterial disease. Conditions that would have been fatal in earlier centuries became manageable. A wound no longer automatically threatened systemic infection. Pneumonia, once a frequent cause of adult mortality, could often be treated successfully. The cumulative effect of these advances extended the average lifespan beyond the reproductive years for a growing portion of the population. Nutrition also improved in many regions due to agricultural intensification, global trade, and industrial food production. While new challenges emerged, such as dietary imbalance and chronic disease, caloric availability became more stable for large segments of the population. Fewer individuals experienced prolonged undernutrition in childhood. Stronger early development contributed to greater resilience in adulthood. Returning to the long timeline of human history highlights the scale of this shift. For nearly 90% of our existence, survival into advanced age was statistically uncommon. Within a few generations, that pattern began to reverse in industrializing societies. The demographic pyramid, once steep and narrow at the top, gradually widened. Old age became not an exception but an increasingly predictable stage of life for many. This transformation represents one of the most dramatic changes in human demographic experience. For the first time, large populations began to expect that they would live long enough to experience decades beyond their reproductive years. As the 20th century progressed, the extension of human lifespan became more consistent across broad segments of the population. Improvements in public health were not confined to a few cities or elite households. Vaccination programs expanded internationally. Antibiotics became widely available. Maternal care improved, reducing the risk of childbirth complications that had claimed many lives for millennia. These changes altered not only average life expectancy but also the distribution of ages within societies. Larger numbers of individuals survived infancy, navigated adulthood, and continued into their 60s and 70s. For the first time in human history, a substantial proportion of the population began to accumulate in older age brackets. This demographic shift reshaped social expectations. Retirement systems emerged in industrial societies, formalizing the idea that work would end before life did. Pensions and social security programs recognized old age as a predictable stage requiring economic planning. Healthcare systems expanded to manage chronic conditions that become more common in later decades, such as cardiovascular disease and certain cancers. These institutional developments reflected a new demographic reality. When a significant percentage of citizens live into advanced age, societies reorganize around that fact. The presence of many elders becomes a structural feature rather than a rare exception. Yet even in this modern context, the increase in longevity did not arise from a fundamental redesign of human biology. The underlying aging processes at the cellular and molecular levels remained similar to those in earlier eras. What changed was the reduction of external mortality. Clean water, improved nutrition, controlled infection, and medical intervention allowed more individuals to survive long enough for intrinsic aging to unfold fully. In previous millennia, many lives ended before the gradual processes of senescence became visible across decades. In the modern era, those processes are now experienced by large populations because earlier hazards have been mitigated. Global patterns of aging illustrate this transition. In many industrialized nations, life expectancy at birth now exceeds 70 or even 80 years. The proportion of individuals over 65 has grown steadily. Some societies face the challenge of supporting aging populations that outnumber children. This demographic reversal would have been unimaginable for most of human history. For nearly 300,000 years, the age pyramid remained steep, with youth dominating numerically. Within a few generations, parts of the world have developed age structures that are rectangular or even inverted. Returning to the long African baseline of Homo sapiens' existence underscores the magnitude of this change. The environments that shaped our evolutionary biology were not those of sanitation systems, antibiotics, or retirement plans. They were landscapes of fluctuating climate, infectious disease, and physical hazard. The rapid expansion of longevity in the last 2 centuries represents a demographic shift layered atop a body designed under very different conditions. Old age has become common not because human aging slowed dramatically, but because more individuals now survive the earlier filters that once limited how many could reach it. The expansion of longevity in the modern era has not only altered statistics, it has changed the texture of human life. When large numbers of individuals survive into their 70s, 80s, and beyond, aging becomes visible across society. Schools, workplaces, healthcare systems, and political institutions all begin to account for older citizens as a substantial demographic presence. This shift represents a departure from nearly all earlier periods of human existence. For most of our history, old age was biologically possible but demographically uncommon. Today, in many parts of the world, it is an expected phase of life. The reasons for this transformation lie primarily in reduced mortality rather than in radical biological change. Vaccination, sanitation, antibiotics, and improved obstetric care lowered the probability of dying in infancy, childhood, and early adulthood. Fewer deaths at the base of the age pyramid allowed larger cohorts to move upward through successive decades. Advances in emergency medicine and surgical care further extended survival after trauma. Chronic conditions that once would have led quickly to death can now be managed for years. The cumulative result is a widening of the upper tiers of the population. The human body itself, however, still reflects its evolutionary origins. Cellular aging continues to involve gradual accumulation of molecular damage, reduced regenerative capacity, and shifts in immune function. What differs is that more individuals now live long enough for these processes to unfold fully. In earlier eras, external hazards often interrupted life before intrinsic aging became the primary determinant of survival. In the modern context, intrinsic aging has become more visible because external mortality has been suppressed. This distinction is essential for understanding why old age has become common only recently. Global demographic data illustrate the scale of change. In some countries, the median age of the population has risen steadily, and the proportion of individuals over 65 approaches or exceeds 1/5 of all citizens. Entire policy debates revolve around pension sustainability and long-term care. Such discussions would have been irrelevant in most prehistoric or ancient communities, where the number of elders was too small to shape economic systems at a national scale. The emergence of aging societies marks a profound shift in human demographic experience. Returning to the deep timeline of Homo sapiens highlights the contrast. For nearly 300,000 years, small groups navigated environments in which many lives ended before advanced age. The body that evolved under those conditions was calibrated for survival through reproduction, not for decades of post-reproductive existence across entire populations. The rapid rise in longevity during the last 2 centuries has placed that body into a new demographic context. Old age is no longer an exception at the margins. It is a widespread stage encountered by millions. This transformation does not erase our evolutionary past, but it reframes it. For the first time, humanity as a whole is living in a world where growing old is common rather than rare. When we place the modern aging population against the backdrop of deep human history, a quiet tension appears. The body we inhabit was shaped across hundreds of thousands of years in environments where widespread old age was rare. Yet we now live in conditions where reaching 70 or 80 is increasingly common in many parts of the world. This contrast does not mean that our biology is malfunctioning. It means that the demographic context has shifted more rapidly than the evolutionary architecture of the body itself. For most of our existence, survival was filtered by early mortality, infectious disease, reproductive risk, and environmental hazard. The few who reached advanced age did so within small groups that were numerically dominated by youth. Today, entire societies are composed of substantial elderly populations. The expectations placed upon the body have changed accordingly. Modern aging brings with it a different profile of health challenges. Chronic diseases such as cardiovascular illness, diabetes, and neurodegenerative conditions have become more prominent precisely because more individuals live long enough for intrinsic aging processes to unfold. In earlier eras, many lives ended before these long-term degenerative patterns became widespread. The visibility of chronic disease in modern societies reflects extended survival rather than an abrupt deterioration of human biology. The same cellular processes that operated quietly in small numbers of elders in prehistoric times are now experienced by millions. Social systems have adapted to this demographic expansion. Retirement, pension planning, geriatric medicine, and long-term care facilities represent institutional responses to a stage of life that was once statistically marginal. In small foraging bands, there was no need for formal retirement structures because few individuals survived into prolonged frailty. Support for elders was personal and communal. In contemporary nations, aging has become a collective demographic phenomenon requiring organized economic and healthcare frameworks. This transformation underscores how unusual our present situation is when viewed across the full span of Homo sapiens history. Returning to the African origins of our species clarifies the depth of this contrast. For nearly 300,000 years, humans navigated fluctuating climates, limited medical knowledge, and high mortality. The body evolved to endure through reproductive years under those pressures. Only in the last 2 centuries has technological and medical innovation systematically removed many of the early filters that once limited survival. As a result, we now witness aging on a scale that our ancestors rarely encountered. The question that follows is not whether old age existed in the past, it did, but whether our species is now living in a demographic condition that is historically unprecedented. For the first time, large portions of humanity expect to grow old. The rarity that once defined elderhood has given way to commonality. In this new context, understanding the long history in which old age was uncommon helps illuminate how profoundly our present moment differs from the vast majority of human experience. When aging becomes common across entire populations, it does more than extend individual lifespans. It reshapes how societies think about time, responsibility, and identity. For most of human history, few people expected to live long past their reproductive years. Life was oriented around survival, child rearing, and immediate continuity. The future rarely stretched across multiple decades of post-productive living for the majority. Today, in many parts of the world, individuals plan for 30 or even 40 years beyond the peak of their working life. Education, career choices, savings, and healthcare decisions are made with the assumption of extended longevity. This shift reflects a demographic reality that would have been unfamiliar to nearly all previous generations of Homo sapiens. The psychological experience of aging also changes in this context. When elders are rare, they stand out as exceptional figures, often associated with accumulated wisdom and survival against the odds. When elders are numerous, aging becomes a shared stage with diverse outcomes. Some remain active and healthy into advanced age. Others experience chronic illness or cognitive decline. The variability of aging becomes more visible when large numbers of individuals reach that stage. This visibility creates new cultural narratives about productivity, independence, and decline. It also introduces new forms of inequality, as access to healthcare and supportive environments influences how aging unfolds. Economically, aging populations alter the balance between generations. In societies where the proportion of older adults grows relative to children, systems of taxation, labor, and care must adapt. This demographic inversion contrasts sharply with the steep pyramids that characterize most of human history, where children and young adults formed the majority. For nearly 300,000 years, communities were structured around youth and active adulthood. Now, in some regions, the median age has risen above 40. The presence of large elderly populations changes political priorities, social services, and family structures. None of these developments negate the deep evolutionary history that shaped the human body. Cellular aging still proceeds according to biological processes inherited from our ancestors. What has changed is the demographic landscape in which those processes unfold. By reducing early mortality and managing infectious disease, modern societies have allowed intrinsic aging to become the dominant driver of mortality in many populations. This transition marks a profound departure from the conditions under which Homo sapiens evolved. Returning to the long African baseline emphasizes the scale of this transformation. For the overwhelming majority of our species' existence, old age was biologically possible but demographically rare. Within only a few centuries, it has become common in large parts of the world. Humanity now inhabits a demographic structure that no previous generation experienced at such scale. The question that arises from this contrast is not simply how long we can live, but how we understand a life that extends so far beyond the evolutionary conditions that first shaped it. For nearly 300,000 years, human life unfolded within a narrow demographic corridor. Many were born, many did not survive childhood, many who reached adulthood faced hazards that ended life before gradual aging became widespread. Old age existed, but it stood at the edge of the population rather than at its center. The human body evolved within that structure. It was shaped by environments that rewarded survival to reproduction, cooperation in small groups, and endurance under fluctuating conditions. It was not shaped in a world where most individuals would spend decades in retirement, managing chronic disease, or reflecting across long stretches of post-productive time. In the last 2 centuries, that corridor widened dramatically. Clean water, vaccination, antibiotics, improved nutrition, and public health systems reduced early mortality and extended adult survival. The demographic pyramid, once steep and narrow at the top, broadened. For the first time in human history, large populations began to anticipate old age as a normal destination. What had once been statistically uncommon became socially central. Entire institutions formed around supporting longer lives. Families reorganized around multi-generational overlap. Economic systems adapted to aging workforces and extended dependency in later decades. Yet the biology beneath these changes remains continuous with our deep past. Cellular aging proceeds through accumulated molecular damage, reduced regenerative capacity, and shifting immune function. These processes did not begin in the modern era. They were always present, quietly unfolding in the small minority who survived long enough to experience them. The difference today is not that aging has suddenly appeared. The difference is that we have removed many of the early filters that once prevented most people from reaching advanced age. We now witness aging on a scale that earlier generations rarely saw. Understanding this long arc reframes how we think about growing old. Old age is not a recent invention, but its widespread presence is recent. For nearly 90% of our history, humanity was demographically young. The societies that shaped our instincts, our social rhythms, and even our biological trade-offs were structured around that youthfulness. Today, we inhabit a world where longevity is common in ways our ancestors did not experience. We are a species formed in scarcity and hazard, now living in relative stability and extended time. If most humans who ever lived never reached what we now call old age, then the fact that so many of us do today is not merely a medical achievement, it is a profound shift in the human condition. The body has not changed as quickly as the environment around it. We carry within us the evolutionary imprint of a past in which aging was possible but rare. Now, we live in an era where it is expected. The quiet question that remains is not how long we can continue to extend life, but how a species shaped by a young past will adapt to a future in which growing old is no longer the exception, but the rule.